When writing for broadcast, we have to keep in mind that broadcast stories have two different audiences, the listener and the announcer. Listeners consume stories differently than readers consume stories. It's an active process when you're reading, but it's an inactive process usually when you're listening. People are doing something else in their car or their house when they're listening to your newscast. Also, keep in mind that the announcer is not always the same person who wrote the story, and sometimes that announcer is reading the story for the first time on the air, so we need to make it as easy as possible for that person to read it clearly and cleanly. There are four types of broadcast leads. Most stories will use either a hard lead or a soft lead, and you can decide which kind you prefer. Sometimes a throwaway lead is appropriate, and sometimes an umbrella lead works if you're dealing with more than one event in the same story. Formatting for broadcast stories is a little bit different than for print stories. In addition to your name, date, and slug on the left side, you want to have the time of newscast. On the right side, you're going to have the length of the story in lines and seconds. We say that one line of broadcast copy is about 3 seconds long. You write the entire broadcast story as one paragraph with no indentation. That'll make it easier for you to count the lines. Just like a print story, you want to use more if there's more than one page, and an end mark of some sort. When writing broadcast stories, keep in mind that a listener is not quite as active a participant in the story as is a reader, so we want to write with that in mind. The next few slides have some tips for doing that.
Uses present tense verbs as much as possible to emphasize recentness. You don't want to force things. If something happened 3 days ago, you don't want to refer to it in the present tense, but as much as possible, use something like says instead of said. Sometimes, if you use the past tense, include the time element right afterward to let people know exactly what happened. For numbers, it's better to round them. If it's 3, there's nowhere to round it, but if it's 2,898, go ahead and round it to almost 3,000. It's going to be much easier for your audience to remember. Also, long titles are really clunky in broadcast. They take up a ton of your time, and you have limited time to tell a story in broadcast. So shorten them, make them more descriptive. With unfamiliar names, you don't want to start out with them. A lot of times listeners might miss who it is, and remember with broadcast, it's not like you can go back and recheck like you can with a print story. Also, too, a lot of times what's happening in the story is more important than the identity of the person. With middle initials, we generally leave them out in broadcast because they're kind of clunky to say. If it's someone who is commonly recognized with their middle name or with the middle initial as part of their name, though, like Edward R. Murrow, it's a good idea to leave it in. Or if you're trying to identify someone who's accused of a crime, especially if they have a very common name. In broadcast writing, you generally don't start out with someone's name. It's better to start out with the description, age, or identification before the person's name to help your listeners know who the person is before you actually name them. Also note in that correct example there's some phonetic spellings. We'll talk about those a bit more later when we talk about writing for your announcer. In broadcasts, we typically will leave out ages and addresses unless there's an important reason to include them. For one thing, they're usually not all that important, and also they take up time, and you'll find when you start writing some broadcast stories that you don't have a whole lot of time to get across what you want to say. Attribution is generally done before what is said in broadcast. You want to say who said what rather than what you do in print, which is what was said and then who said it. And with direct quotes, we typically avoid them in broadcast because your listener can't hear quotation marks. If there's a really good reason to use a quote, make sure you're being very clear to the listener that you are quoting someone directly. Homonyms are best avoided in broadcast writing. Those are words that sound alike but have different meanings. As you might imagine, if you're listening to something with a homonym, your brain is going to take a few seconds to figure out which word you're talking about, and while your brain is doing that, it's missing what else is being said. Also, pronouns are best avoided when they're going to be confusing. Sometimes they are fine, but if there's 3 women in a story and you say she, a lot of times it's not clear who she is.
When writing for your announcer, you want to make it as easy as possible for your announcer to say things properly on the air. Keep in mind the announcer probably isn't thinking about what he's reading while he's reading it on the air, so you want to make it as workable as possible. The pointers in the next few slides won't cover everything that will come up, but it'll cover the majority of things.
The rule of numbers is different for broadcast than it is for print. For numbers 1 through 11, you want to write those out, not use digits. Sometimes they can be confusing, and the reason that we go through 11 instead of 9 like in print is because two ones together looks like a whole heck of a lot like two lowercase l's or two i's. For 12 through 999, use digits unless they begin a sentence or indicate an address, age, or date. When you get bigger than that, you're going to use a combination of numerals and words. $100,000, if it's written with digits and a dollar sign like we do in print, can be difficult to read, but 100, the word thousand, the word dollars is a whole lot clearer. There are very few absolutes in this course, but a couple of them come up on this slide. One is never abbreviate anything. If you abbreviate things in broadcast, it's basically asking your announcer to mispronounce it. Also, we never use a period for a decimal. If you have to use a number that has a decimal in it for broadcast, write out the word point, but it's better if you can round it or use fractions. Also, if you have words or numbers or letters that are to be read individually, you want to put hyphens between them so your announcer doesn't try to say them like words. So WSU is going to take hyphens in it. A phone number should have hyphens in it for individual numbers so that your announcer says them as individual numbers and doesn't try to jam them together. In this example, if you wanted to do 93-21 at the end of my phone number, so the announcer would say 9321, that's fine, but you don't want to just jam it all together like normal. If it's an acronym that's supposed to be read like a word, like NASA, you don't want hyphens in that. As you might guess, announcers are not big fans of alliteration and tongue twisters and those sorts of things, so try to avoid those in your broadcast writing. Punctuation should be limited. Periods, comma, ellipses. Remember the three dots means that you generally means that something's left out. For broadcast, though, it basically is telling your announcer to take a long pause. Other punctuation, you don't really need it because your listener cannot see it. One final tip on this, think of your announcer as a mindless reading machine. I actually had a student of mine who worked in radio tell me that, so it's not me trying to disparage broadcasters. He basically told me that a lot of announcers basically read things exactly as they are on the sheet and aren't really thinking about them as they're reading them. So you want to basically make it as easy as possible for your announcer to read things correctly on the air.